Earlier this week, Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the court's 4 liberals to allow states to continue to bar judges running in judicial elections from soliciting campaign contributions. But in so doing, he might have also laid the groundwork for eventually overturning Citizens United philosophically, if not technically. So this is part of his writing in the case having to do with the judicial elections. He said, states may regulate judicial elections differently than they regulate political elections because the role of judges differs from the role of politicians. Politicians are expected to be appropriately responsive to the preferences of their supporters. Indeed, such responsiveness is key to the very concept of self-governance through elected officials. The same is not true of judges. In deciding cases, a judge is not to follow the preferences of his supporters or provide any special consideration to his campaign donors. A judge instead must observe the utmost fairness, striving to be perfectly and completely independent, with nothing to influence or control him but God and his conscience.
Who writes like that?
Who writes that? First of all, I hope that God isn't overly influencing him, but he thinks he is drawing a very special distinction between those two categories, between judges and politicians. Do you agree that distinction met?
Who spells control like it's soul?
I think he either made a mistake or he was born in Britain 200 years ago.
No, it's actually probably one of his interns is British.
Right.
That's probably because they write the opinions. Okay, well, there we go. Okay, something. All right, just waiting for the camera. All right, this is an interesting admission. So he says if you take money, you might be influenced by that money. You might be corrupted by that money. Now, judges are supposed to be perfectly independent, according to this. Politicians, on the other hand, apparently are not supposed to be perfectly independent. They're supposed to be biased. Okay, that's an interesting admission.
Can I cut you off there before you go on? Because I just want to point out one thing that I found incredibly telling about this opinion. Politicians are expected to be appropriately responsive to the preferences of their supporters. Indeed, such responsiveness is key to the very concept of self-government through elected officials. Right? Okay. Then, the same is not true of judges. In deciding cases, a judge is not to follow the preferences of his supporters or provide any special consideration to his campaign donors. I just find it incredibly curious that the part where he talks sort of about politicians, he doesn't mention campaign donors. For politicians, the money only comes from your supporters. You're responsive to your supporters. Judges might be responsive to campaign donors, but he doesn't talk about it with politicians
because politicians only get a $10 bill handed to them by a grandmother. That's the only way they get funded.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But he's equating them. So I mean, logically, if because of the way he's voting on this, you have to include the campaign donors in the politicians' part, and you're then sort of duty bound to reverse Citizens United.
Yeah, and he makes the case for why it shouldn't be allowed there. I mean, if you are supposed to be responsive to your constituents. That's the very definition of what democratic governance is supposed to be. And if one person in your district has an interest, it should weigh very little on your conscience. If almost everyone wants something, that's what you should push for. What money does is it totally gets rid of that distinction between an interest that is an interest to one person or 10 people versus millions. You're able to, just by handing over money, make it seem as if this is a much more pressing issue than it actually is, or that it deserves your attention in a way that it doesn't. That's what's so corrupting about it. He seems to understand that in what he says, but he refuses to go as far as he needs to in applying it to all the categories that merit it.
So Supreme Court justices, as much as we might be frustrated by them, are not dumb people, right? So John Roberts isn't dumb. Justice Kennedy, who made the original decision in Citizens United, is not dumb. They know when they're conflating things, so they switch. Ben made a great point there. They goes, well, the politician's supposed to be responsive to his supporters. No, but wait a minute. He's supposed to be responsive to his citizens, right? And you're conflating those two things. The supporters are campaign donors, so it's one thing to be responsive to 10 guys who gave you $1 million apiece.
Who might not even live in your district or your state.
Oftentimes do not live in your district. And to be responsive to your supporters who are your voters who didn't give you that money. Now, so they're not responsive to their voters. We know because of a Princeton study that over 20 years, judge looked at 1,800 policies and said public opinion has zero effect on public policy. Special interest opinion has a direct correlation to policy. So when they say supporters in the case of politicians, they mean campaign donors. You should be responsive to the billionaires who are bribing you, right? When it comes to judges, they flip it and they mean, well, you can't. No, campaign. Now we mean campaign donors, and that would be outrageous, and that would influence you. Of course, it would influence you if you're a judge, and of course, it would influence you if you're a politician. Of course, it would. It's absurd to claim otherwise. They're not that stupid. They know that. but they're Republicans, and so they think the Republicans win the battle of corruption. They think the Republicans get bribed more than Democrats. They're largely right. They want to give the Republicans an enormous structural advantage because they're the party of bribes.
Yeah.
So, and it's not like Democrats don't take bribes. They take billion-dollar bribes too in mass. But they know the Republicans will always have the ability to get more bribes.
Yeah.
Look, I'll give you one last fact that is fascinating about this. People who are campaign donors gave in the last $5.8 billion overall, okay? And so to the last Congress, $5.8 billion. It's an amazing amount of money, right? Now, why would they do that? Out of the goodness of their health? Because you know what? I am your supporter. I like your policies.
It's their hobby.
I like gardening. You like gardening. I'll give you $5.8 billion. Okay. Now, you want to know how much they got back in those same people from policies that were passed from those politicians?
Give or take $5.8 billion.
$4.4 trillion. Okay. So, I mean, what ironically Justice Roberts is referring to here, and Justice Kennedy did in Citizens United, is public financing, where you would get $10 from the local, your neighbors, et cetera, and there would be a cap. There'd be a very strict cap, so you couldn't have a millionaire or a billionaire come in and bribe you. You'd have to get $10 at a time to know you had real support, and then you would have an even playing field, and that would be public financing, and those would be your supporters, right? That's the system that does make sense. The system that doesn't make sense, and people say about public financing, oh no, but that would be so expensive. You're giving money to politicians. How expensive is $4.4 trillion? Yeah. They're given away in a store, and that store is our store if you're a taxpayer. You're a conservative who cares about not paying a lot of taxes. They're giving away your taxes in droves, literally in trillions of dollars. And now the Supreme Court says, well, of course that's true if it's the case of a judge. And if it's the case of a politician, though, he's saintly and would never be corrupted by the billions of dollars he's getting. It is absurd on its face, and they know it.